He was a retired veteran enjoying his golden years in the Southwest.
They ended up being stationed in Arizona, and he fell in love with it out there.
He kept his circle very small. He was close with his brother and his family and was living his life.
But a comfortable retirement would be upended by a devastating fire.
The calls reported sounds of an explosion and a house that was fully engulfed in flames. The owner of the house is missing.
The investigators find large, open, empty safes inside.
I knew something wasn't right.
As the investigation unfolds, the search for a missing person will escalate to the hunt for a killer.
There had been a considerable amount of blood.
We were treating it as a homicide investigation,
culminating in a nationwide manhunt for a pair of dangerous fugitives who will stop at nothing for freedom.
There's Bonnie and Clyde on the run. Their violent tendencies could come through, especially in desperation.
Both of them showed this greed. She didn't necessarily want to see him killed, but we all know how it ended.
She was so blinded by this fantasy that he was presenting to her. His character came shining through, full, bright beacon, like a lighthouse of evil.
With its warm weather and breathtaking scenery, Tucson, Arizona ranks as one of the Southwest's most popular places to call home.
Really what draws people to Tucson is a sense of community, affordability, fun things to do, and the climate that we have. It allows you to be active year-round.
On April 16th, 2019, a dark cloud looms over that community when residents of one quiet neighborhood are jolted awake at 4 a.m.
They all awoke to the sounds of this explosion and this fire.
Within seconds, Tucson dispatchers receive a flurry of calls.
The calls reported a house that was fully engulfed in flames. The neighbors who called in were scared. So the fire department responded immediately. It was important to get this fire put out as quickly as possible, not only so that they could get inside the residence to determine if anybody needed medical help, but also to prevent that fire from spreading to other houses in the neighborhood.
By daylight, firefighters are finally able to extinguish the blaze. But the home is destroyed.
By the time they got it put out, there were portions of the roof that had caved in, portions of walls that had come down.
The home was a complete loss. And so Tucson Police Department arrived on scene.
The first thing that they're going to collectively do between both of the field public safety resources is look for victims, which they didn't find that night.
The owner of the house is missing. Where's the homeowner?
Detectives don't have to wait long for the answer.
Later on that same day, April 16th, William Skip Bly called Tucson police to request a check welfare on his brother Frank.
Every Sunday, either he called me or I called him. And that last Sunday that I called him, which was April 7th, there was no answer. And I called Monday, no answer. Wednesday, I called, no answer. And I'm sitting there, I said, this is not like him at all. Something's not right here. So I called the police department.
Police ultimately responded out to the house, and it was at that point that police realized, oh, this is the same house where that house fire and the explosion had occurred earlier on.
The important part of the conversation with William at that point in time was to obtain as much information about Frank as possible to assist us in locating him.
Originally from Connecticut, 72-year-old Frank Bly had called Arizona home for more than 4 decades.
He graduated in '66, and he joined the Air Force. He spent 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. He was a helicopter and jet mechanic, and they ended up being stationed in Tucson, Arizona, and he fell in love with it out there.
After retiring from active duty, Frank bought a home in Tucson and worked in the aviation industry.
So he joined the Air Force Reserves. Loved that. He went flying all over the world. He got a job working for Grumman Northrop, and they were working on, he was either the stealth fighter or the stealth bomber, one or the other. It was all top secret.
In his spare time, the deserts and long stretches of highway outside Tucson afforded Frank the opportunity to practice his two favorite hobbies.
My brother was a very avid gun collector. He had quite an extensive collection of guns. Also, my brother had motorcycles. He had Harleys, he had dirt bikes. There was times that when I used to go out and visit him, we'd go riding together. In fact, he rode with a bunch of guys from Tucson up to Sturgis, South Dakota. My brother used to go on these trips all the time because he wasn't married. He was a guy, you know. He did what he wanted.
By 2019, Frank had settled into his golden years and enjoyed a weekly social routine.
He would go to breakfast with his friends the same day of the week, every week without fail. He would go to the same bar, meet with the same group of friends, have one or two beers, and then he would leave and go home.
He kept his circle very small. He was close with his brother and his family and was living his life.
But on April 16th, 2019, concern grows when Frank's home erupts into flames and the 72-year-old is nowhere to be found. Inside, detectives uncover evidence of arson.
Tucson police concluded that accelerants were found inside the house. They have the odor of gasoline, and that led them to conclude that the fire was deliberately set.
When you are searching a residence that has been burned, it creates a number of different challenges. First and foremost is that fires destroy physical evidence. It prohibits the responding, investigating detectives to be able to obtain any sort of physical evidence from the crime scene itself, such as DNA or fibers or fingerprints.
As investigators were walking through the house, police investigators noted multiple gun safes that were inside the residence. They were open, unlocked, and they were empty. There were no guns inside them.
When the investigators find large, open, empty safes inside of a house, it's certainly a suspicious factor at that point. They would have been concluding that someone had perhaps deliberately set the fire after having taken items, probably valuable items, from inside those safes.
It was potential evidence of some kind of theft or potential robbery. Like, the fire damage eradicated a lot of potential evidence for us.
The only place that was left intact, so to speak, was the garage portion of the residence.
The information that Skip gave investigators was that his brother Frank had two cars. He had an old pickup truck and he had a red or maroon passenger car. And now that pickup truck was in the garage when the fire occurred. However, the red passenger car was missing. We need to locate Frank.
Coming up, a discovery on a remote highway all but confirms detectives' worst fears.
At that point, we were treating it as a homicide investigation.
There had been a considerable amount of blood in the trunk.
And a disturbing phone call reveals someone else may be in danger.
She called me and she's like, I gotta leave town. She was panicked. I was really concerned that he would just kill her.
Detectives in Tucson, Arizona are searching for 72-year-old Frank Bly after discovering his house ransacked and set on fire.
Well, at that point, we don't know if Frank has been the victim of some kind of foul play, if Frank has had some role in his house burning down. We know that Frank's missing, and a vehicle is missing from his residence as well.
As authorities begin searching for Frank's car, detectives follow up with Frank's brother, William Skip Bly, to update him on the situation.
We were in a complete fog. What was going on. My brother's missing. I knew something wasn't right.
It was very unusual for Frank to kind of drop off the radar. According to Skip, Frank led a very regimented lifestyle. So he had a very set routine, and he rarely deviated from that routine.
I told the detectives that the cow pony was his Sunday routine.
Detective Cheek and I spoke to a bartender at the cow pony whom remembered Frank and knew who he was.
The last person that we were able to find at that point who had seen him was the folks at the cow pony that saw him leaving on, I believe, April 7th.
According to the bartender, Frank was alone that night, but a few weeks earlier, someone had joined him for drinks.
Questioning the bartender further, she remembered a friend of Frank's coming in that was introduced as Sue.
When detectives run the name by William, he informs them that Sue is Frank's close friend, 58-year-old Susan Barksdale.
Detectives learned that Susan and Frank were longtime friends.
Sue was married to Frank's boss. I guess that's how he ended up meeting her. And my brother, he got to be very good friends with Sue and the family and the kids and everything. They called him Uncle Frank.
Susan was married previously and divorced. After that, Susan had married another male by the name of Blaine Barksdale. Susan lived in the Sholo area, and that's a location roughly 4 hours north of Tucson. It's comprised of several towns. One of those is Vernon, Arizona.
So Detective Cheek and I interviewed Susan. Through the course of the interview, Susan seemed concerned for Frank.
She had no idea what had happened with Frank and didn't know where he was. We asked them when the last time she saw Frank was.
According to Susan, she had last seen Frank on April 12th.
She said both she and Blaine had been in Tucson. They had seen Frank. They had been at Frank's house.
She and Blaine ended up driving back to Vernon, and she claimed that that was the last time she'd spoken with him.
Susan promises to contact authorities if she hears from Frank. In the meantime, Tucson police focus their efforts on finding Frank's car and release its description to neighboring communities. One day later, they get a call from the sheriff's department.
The day after the fire, Pima County Sheriff's deputy sees a vehicle on South Wilmot Road about 10 miles away from Frank Bly's house. And the vehicle is pulled over on the side of the road. Nobody's inside the vehicle.
When the Sheriff's Department personnel ran the license plate, it returned to Frank, and they notified us that they had located the vehicle.
That was a huge step forward in the investigation.
Immediately, personnel from the department responded to this area and began a ground search in an attempt to locate Frank.
There's no sign of Frank in the surrounding desert. But when authorities search his car, they make a harrowing discovery.
The vehicle was fairly clean. However, in the trunk, there was visual signs of blood. And there were bags with rags that were soaked in gasoline.
We used a chemical reagent to figure out that there had been a considerable amount of blood in the trunk at one time. They were able to collect and figure out that it was Frank's blood through DNA tests. The fact that the blood was in Frank's own vehicle led them to the conclusion that Frank had been seriously injured, he had bled, and then somebody had placed him into the trunk of his own car, where he'd been for at least some period of time after that.
Just based on the quantity of blood that appeared to have been in that trunk, I believed that Frank had died, that he had been murdered. At that point, we were treating it as a homicide investigation.
Unfortunately, there is little evidence to suggest who had put him there.
There weren't many leads at this point in time.
Then, 1 week into the investigation, the daughter of Frank's close friend, Susan Barksdale, reaches out to law enforcement, claiming to have received an alarming call from her mother.
She called me from a random number And she's like, I gotta go, I gotta leave town. Like, you could hear it in her voice. She was panicked.
Jada expressed to investigators that Susan's husband, Blaine, was a danger, and she was concerned that he hurt Frank.
I believe Blaine saw Frank as a threat. He knew that, Frank and my mother had been good friends for many years.
They would hang out together. They would go to eat together. Susan would go out shooting with Frank.
But Jada claims that when her mother married Blaine, he became jealous of her relationship with Frank.
Blaine had a lot of control over my mom, and he was very verbally, emotionally, and eventually physically abusive with my mother. Anyone who knew my mom knew that she's very assertive in her opinions and beliefs, just a very strong personality. And he was able to chip away at her very strong personality until she was just terrified to have an opinion about anything. I know that Frank did confront Blaine about this abuse and, said to keep your hands off Sue. Blaine knew that, Frank could help her get on her feet if she decided to leave him.
Jada tells detectives that she can no longer get a hold of her mother, and she believes Blaine has taken her hostage.
I was really concerned that he would just kill her. I believe her life was absolutely in danger.
Authorities immediately attempt to locate Susan and Blaine at their residence, but they're too late.
They are nowhere to be found. We did, however, locate some of Blaine's family members up in that area, and they were able to tell us that Blaine talked about signing over titles of vehicles to them. He talked about, hey, can you check on our dog? We're leaving our dog. And that was obviously suspicious to us. That was suspicious to family as well. It didn't make any sense as to why Susan and Blaine would be doing this. By all appearances, it seemed that Susan and Blaine were just walking away from that property, their vehicles, their dog, and never coming back. It was clear to us at that point that Susan and Blaine were going on the run.
1 week after Frank Bly's home erupted into flames, Frank is presumed dead, and detectives are searching for his friend Susan Barksdale and her husband Blaine.
Blaine and Susan were nowhere to be found. In speaking with some of their friends and family, we learned that they had indicated that they were leaving town. So investigators served a search warrant on the Barksdale's property in Vernon. Through the course of that search, detectives were able to locate some cell phones.
We were able to actually access the content of those cell phones.
When detectives perform a forensic analysis on the phones, they uncover a potential clue.
One of the cell phones that belonged to Susan, there were deleted text messages that we recovered from that phone.
Around the time that Frank's home went up in flames, Susan had been in contact with a person named Brent.
And so that became immediately significant to us. They were sent the morning of the fire on April 16th. And in those text messages, Susan expressed concern that Brent and Blaine had become separated from each other in Tucson, where Frank lived.
The phone number for Brent was researched by Tucson police detectives. They were able to figure out Brent was Brent Mallard.
We learned that Blaine was his uncle. On April 24th, we worked with police in the Avondale area. That's in the outskirts of Phoenix. And they were able to locate an address associated to Brent Mallard.
When detectives meet with Brent, they're immediately taken off guard by his appearance.
Detective Cheek and I observed that he had numerous bandages over different parts of his body. He had abrasions on his face, and the marks on him and the injuries appeared to be that of burns. I remember just looking at Detective Cheek and having a moment, because burns all over your body are that's a clue.
Detectives ask Brent to accompany them to the station for an interview.
We didn't tell Brent initially what we were talking to him for, and he was cooperative and calm. Brent initially stated that he was in fact burned, but he stated that it was due to a welding accident.
Coincidentally, he talked about sustaining these burns around the same time period as the fire that occurred at Frank's house.
We didn't believe his story, and we began to press him even harder in the interview for him to just come clean and tell us the truth.
And it was at that point that he admitted that he'd lied to us.
Brent eventually told Detective Cheek and I that he was involved in the arson and lighting the fire at Frank's house.
According to Brent, on April 15th, his uncle had asked him for a ride to Tucson.
Brent advised that Blaine provided a gun as payment and gave Brent a Ruger pistol for him to drive to Tucson.
He and Blaine drove to Tucson. They went to a house, and Blaine had a garage remote control, or a clicker, that activated the remote control and opened the garage at this residence.
Blaine had entered the home and had some gasoline. Blaine took the gasoline and spilled it throughout the house.
Brent tells police, to his shock, his uncle ordered him to ignite the accelerant.
Blaine told Brent that he was going to do it, and that if he had told anyone, he would be in serious danger. Brent felt extremely threatened, stated he got a rolled-up magazine, lit the magazine and threw it further into the home.
The fire flashed back at Brent. He ended up sustaining some serious burn injuries to his hands and his arms and his face. Brent described running away on foot, and he said that Blaine took off in a vehicle. This was huge because this was the first time we had anybody directly implicating Blaine Barksdale in the arson fire that occurred at the residence.
Detectives finally have the confession they need, but the whereabouts of Frank's body is still unclear.
Brett indicated that at no time did he see the homeowner or know who Frank Bly was.
Brent said that he had no idea as to where Frank was, and he said that Blaine was very cautious not to give him details.
It didn't make much sense to a degree why Brent had involved himself in this particular incident. However, I think that, part of Brent wanted to prove himself to Blaine, and also felt that he was a dangerous person and didn't want to cross him, based upon the descriptions given and his admitted involvement. Brent was arrested for arson.
Hoping to learn more about Blaine and where he might go, detectives continue interviewing his family members.
The same day that we interviewed Brent Mallard, we interviewed his mother, Thaleen, Blaine's sister.
Thaleen tells detectives that her brother had a troubled childhood growing up in Tucson.
He dropped out of school. He was arrested right before his 18th birthday for selling drugs and stealing and selling like ATVs and things. I believe he got 7 years that time for that. Blaine got married right after he got out of prison, I believe. He had 3 children and then went back to prison, another drug case, and they divorced while he was in prison. So basically, he kind of grew up in the prison system.
After his release from prison in 2011, Thaleen says Blaine earned an honest living as a woodworker.
He went to work building cabinets and things like that, crayon and that type of thing, and that was where he met Susan. I thought that she was great for Blaine. I didn't know what she saw in him, but I was happy because I thought maybe that would settle him down. guess I was wrong.
Thylene has no idea where her brother is now, and she agrees with Jada that Susan is likely in danger.
We continually interviewed friends and family of Susan Barksdale and Blaine Barksdale. And what family has been able to tell us is that after the fire, Blaine ultimately procured or purchased an RV for cash.
Detectives issue a bolo for the RV and alert the U.S. Marshal Service.
The U.S. Marshals have more resources in that regard because if somebody flees the state of Arizona, the Marshals can be anywhere. And they can use a variety of different methods to locate and track potential fugitives.
On May 23rd, more than a month after Frank went missing, authorities get a hit when Blaine and Susan are spotted in New York.
They were pawning items of property in a pawn shop. Anytime a person goes to a pawn shop, they have to show a photo ID if they're going to sell or pawn an item at that pawn shop. I don't know if Susan realized it, but when she did that, it set up a flag, and as soon as we conducted a records query on her name, we were able to determine that that pawn had actually occurred, where it had occurred, and surveillance images of Susan actually going into the shop.
Detectives are relieved to learn Susan is alive, but whether she is acting of her own accord or not is still a mystery to law enforcement.
We knew they were in the motorhome, and we passed it on to the New Jersey, New York deputies out there. They were able to locate them at a motel parking lot in the Rochester area late that night.
In the early morning hours of May 24th, 2019, authorities set up a perimeter.
They had the state troopers, the SWAT, they had brought everybody out there. If you take in the criminal history of Blaine with the desperation and then mix that with guns that were missing and taken, you never know what you're gonna get.
Coming up, law enforcement have their suspect in their crosshairs, but a daring escape will leave the whole case in jeopardy.
When you're on the run, your propensity for violence is very high.
And I'd never seen an operation of this magnitude.
More than a month into the search for assumed murder victim Frank Bly, authorities in upstate New York have surrounded a motorhome linked to their primary suspect, Blaine Barksdale, and his wife, Susan.
We didn't know what Blaine was going to do. We certainly considered the possibility that he was armed and dangerous.
When you're on the run and you're fleeing, your propensity for violence is very high.
At 3:30 a.m., authorities cautiously approached the vehicle and announced their presence.
We just had to wait and be patient till Blaine came out. Then moments later, Susan came out.
After more than 3 weeks on the run, the Barksdales are taken into custody and transported to the Monroe County Jail in Rochester, New York. When Arizona detectives arrive, Blaine refuses to give a statement. But Susan appears anxious to talk.
When I first saw Susan, she seemed extremely frightened. She was crying, and it sure appeared like she had two black eyes, was the first thing that I noticed about her. Susan claimed that she had been beaten by Blaine throughout their trip across the country. In addition, she told Detective Cheek and I some additional information about the events prior to Frank's disappearance. Frank had indicated that if anything were to happen to him, he wanted her to be responsible for his items. Frank had a large number of his gun safes throughout his house. Susan claims that Blaine was present when Frank showed her the combinations.
Susan explains that Blaine saw an opportunity to make some quick cash.
She'd indicated that Blaine had been taking guns from Frank for a period of time. She'd indicated he was selling some of those guns to a male in the Sholo area.
Blaine was a very opportunistic person, very manipulative. He knew that Frank had guns, money. He saw an opportunity to benefit from Frank.
Susan said that Blaine was afraid that Frank was going to find out that he had been stealing his guns from him.
According to Susan, that's when Blaine made the decision to kill Frank. On April 12, 2019, 4 days before the fire, Susan was visiting with Frank at his home when Blaine arrived, and a confrontation broke out between the two men.
Frank's guns had been stolen. Frank confronted Blaine about that. She says that Blaine and Frank were having a discussion or an argument. Frank left to walk down the hall, and that Blaine walked down the hall after Frank. She heard a loud thud, and she figured something bad had happened. She said she didn't see what happened.
She came around a corner. She described seeing Frank on the ground bleeding from his head and Blaine standing over him.
And that's when she learned that Frank had been killed by Blaine.
Susan told us that Blaine forced her to clean up the blood and threatened to come after Susan's family if Susan did not help him clean this evidence up. At one point, Blaine moved Frank's body, but Susan claimed she didn't know where. Susan described driving her car back from Tucson to Vernon, and she said that Blaine drove Frank's car. At one point in time, she lost track of where Blaine was, and then he later arrived at their property up in Vernon.
Susan denied that she had any involvement after that point besides cleaning up.
Susan says that she was a victim of Blaine and was doing what Blaine directed her to do. Susan felt threatened.
Despite her willingness to cooperate with law enforcement, authorities charged Susan with multiple crimes, including first-degree murder, first-degree burglary, arson, felony criminal damage, and theft.
Susan was able to confirm much of the evidence and our suspicions of everything. What Susan couldn't confirm was the location of Frank's remains.
Blaine faces the same charges as Susan. And in late August of 2019, the couple is extradited back to Arizona.
A subcontractor or a third-party vendor was responsible for the transportation of Blaine and Susan. This guard company was driving Blaine and Susan through South Utah when Blaine claimed that he had to use the restroom. Blaine was able to slip his handcuffs in front of his person, grab a hold of the guard. The guards were not armed at the time of this offense. There was no weapons readily available to them. Blaine was able to force both guards into the holding area of the vehicle. He had both of them remove their shirts, which were uniform shirts. Blaine and Susan put these shirts on.
He detained them, locked them up inside the transport van.
They kidnapped the guards. They drove quite a distance.
At some point, Blaine and Susan left the guards locked into this transport vehicle, and they left with unknown individuals in this red truck. I was in complete disbelief. I've done this job for a number of years, and I've never had anything even remotely like this happen on any of my cases that I've investigated.
We believe that Susan was an accomplice at this point, that Blaine was the one that was kind of the mastermind of how they were going to be able to get away at that point when they kidnapped the guards.
They were going on the run, and they were going to try to put as much distance between themselves and investigators as possible.
And at that point, the chase was on.
In August of 2019, Blaine Barksdale and his wife Susan have escaped after being extradited for the murder of Frank Bly. Authorities from Utah to Arizona are desperately searching for the fugitives after receiving reports they've been spotted in a red truck.
They've gained access to this red GMC pickup truck that became famous overnight in Arizona. Every billboard over all the interstates and the highways, DPS had already put up, look out for that vehicle. The media had really picked up on that. There's Bonnie and Clyde on the run.
Obviously, Blaine's actions indicated that he was a threat and that he was dangerous. Additionally, what's important to remember is that we have still dozens and dozens of firearms that are unaccounted for. We didn't know if Blaine had hidden those firearms somewhere where he might retain access to them.
We believe that from Blanding, Utah, they came down into kind of northeast Arizona, and that's where the marshals and our task force and all of our partners really kind of picked up the pieces and started the hunt.
As the manhunt intensifies, authorities work to track down the couple's known contacts. In her earlier conversation with detectives, Susan had dropped a possible tip.
Susan stated that Blaine sold a number of Frank's guns to a man in Sholo, Arizona, and identified him. We responded to his residence and interviewed him. He was in possession of a large number of guns, but he purchased those guns not from Blaine, but from Susan.
Blaine has a pretty checkered criminal history. He has a past. But how was he able to turn this lady, who lived a very normal life for all these decades, now into being something else?
Both of them were committing criminal acts. Both of them showed this greed that they needed to have more money, and they thought it was a good idea to get that money by selling Frank's guns. I think all of those reasons are why Susan could bypass and look past the long friendship that she had with Frank. She didn't necessarily want to see him killed, I'm sure, but we all know how it ended.
16 days into the manhunt, authorities receive a tip that the couple could be hiding out in a notorious stretch of northern Arizona.
It's a very rural, rugged, remote area, and a lot of people will go there just to hide from law enforcement.
We were able to put together information from a call that we got to this guy that's on probation that lives in the area that happened to be in custody in the past with Blaine. There's a likelihood that Blaine and Susan are there. And so that's when the decision was made, and it was put together of a plan that we're going to go and surround this house.
It was a large lot with a lot of vehicles and outbuildings. There's no streetlights in this area. It was a dark night.
We wanted to make sure that we can make contact and as safe as possible in case Blaine, Susan, or this other guy decided we're going to shoot it out.
It was a very tense period of time there. We were not going to allow them to escape again.
While a helicopter moves into position, authorities on the ground move in.
We started making the commands over the loudspeaker, both by loudspeaker that was down on the ground, and also we asked the helicopter to put out announcements and turn on the spotlight. We wanted Blaine and Susan to know that there was nowhere that they could escape from or that they could go to. Their only safe option was to come to us.
After several tense minutes, the homeowner emerges and Susan follows.
Moments later, Blaine Barksdale exits the residence with his hands up, and he's complying with the directives and the orders of the officers. As he approached the marshals that were getting ready to take him into custody, it was almost like he had a change of mind last minute, and he became very aggressive.
He started cussing out the officers who were in front of him. He dropped his hands close to his waistband. Blaine was pretty agitated, still wasn't compliant. They used beanbag rounds, and they hit Blaine. One of them struck him in the leg and kind of took his leg out from under him. That's when the team goes in there and puts cuffs on him.
All right, they've got hands on him now.
With Susan and Blaine Barksdale finally in custody, authorities push them for intel on the whereabouts of Frank Bly's body.
Yeah, we were able to negotiate plea agreements in the case, so Blaine agreed to plead guilty to a second-degree murder with a sentencing range of 19 to 22 years. And as part of his plea deal, he had to reveal the whereabouts of Frank Bly.
He stated that he pushed Frank Bly's body out over the edge of a cliff in Salt River Canyon.
Following an exhaustive search, Arizona authorities finally recover Frank's remains on January 4th, 2022.
And everybody said, oh, you must have closure now. You never have closure. You never will. Because you always sit there and say, why did this happen?
Blaine said he had been kind of out of his mind during that time. He'd been using meth. He felt terrible about getting himself into trouble, killing Frank, and then getting Susan into trouble as well. Blaine was never blaming Susan for Frank's death and was trying to take as much of the blame as he could throughout the process. So the relative roles of Blaine and Susan were pretty clear. Blaine was more culpable. Blaine admits that.
My mother was under extreme duress during this entire time period. The only reason my mom went anywhere with that man was in an effort to protect her family because our lives were under threat by Blaine.
Susan says she's a victim. She says that Blaine made a lot of threats towards her and forced her to do things that she didn't want to do. Only Susan really knows how much of a victim she was and how willing or unwilling of a participant she was in Frank's death.
Prosecutors also cut a deal with Susan.
Susan pled guilty to manslaughter, which is a less serious crime than second-degree murder and first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 5 years prison.
I believe that Frank was trying to stand up for my mom, who was being terribly abused, and Blaine ended his life for it.
None of this would have happened to Frank if it weren't for Blaine, and none of it would have happened to Frank if it weren't for Susan. If those two don't come together, Frank's still with us today.
My brother, I miss our Sunday conversations. You know, going out and seeing him. He lived the life that he wanted, which I couldn't ask anything less of anybody.
It begins on an ordinary street in southwest London, the kind of place where nothing remarkable is supposed to happen. A row of houses sits quietly behind low fences, their windows dimly lit against the early evening sky. The pavement is narrow, worn smooth by years of footsteps, commuters returning home, students dragging tired feet after long days. Young people moving through routines so familiar they barely notice the path beneath them. There is no sense of danger here, no warning written into the air, just the quiet rhythm of a city settling into night. And yet, beneath that normalcy, something is already out of place. Not something visible, not something anyone could point to or name, but a presence, an intention, moving unseen through the same streets as everyone else. A young woman walks alone, her thoughts likely occupied with the ordinary details of her life. Work, plans, perhaps nothing at all. The kind of quiet mental drift that comes at the end of a long day. She is not being followed in any way she can perceive. There are no footsteps echoing hers, no shadows stretching unnaturally behind her. If there is a vehicle nearby, it blends into the background of the city, just another car passing through, just another part of the environment she has known all her life. And that is precisely what makes what happens next so deeply unsettling. Because there is no escalation, no argument, no warning, no moment in which she could sense that something is about to go wrong. The violence, when it comes, is immediate and absolute. It erupts into existence without explanation, without hesitation, without any clear reason at all. It is not personal. It is not targeted in the way people expect crimes to be. There is no relationship between victim and attacker. No shared history that might offer context or understanding. Instead, there's only randomness, cold, disorienting, impossible to predict. The kind of randomness that changes how people see the world, because it suggests that safety itself may be an illusion. In the days that follow, there will be questions. There are always questions. Who would do this? Why this person? Why here? Why now? But the answers will not come easily. Because the truth, when it begins to take shape, will reveal something far more disturbing than a single act of violence. It will reveal a pattern, a series of moments scattered across time and place, each one connected not by motive or logic, but by something far more difficult to understand, a compulsion, a preference for vulnerability, a willingness to act without reason. And at the center of it all is a man who, at first glance, does not stand out. A man who moves through the same streets, the same neighborhoods, the same routines as everyone else. A man named Levi Belfield. He was not a stranger to violence. Those who encountered him in everyday life would have noticed something, an edge of volatility, a temper that could surface without warning. He had a history of aggression, of control, particularly toward women. But none of that, on its own, marked him as what he would become. Because what makes this case so unsettling is not just the brutality of the acts themselves. It is the absence of a clear boundary between ordinary life and extraordinary violence. Belfield did not operate in the shadows in the way people imagine. He did not disappear into some hidden world. Instead, he existed in plain sight, moving through the same environments as his victims, blending into the background until the moment he chose to act. And when he did act, it was with a directness that left little room for interpretation. There was no elaborate planning visible on the surface, no attempt to create distance between himself and what he was doing. The weapon he used was simple. The method was direct. The outcome was devastating. In the years that would follow, investigators would begin to piece together what had happened. Not all at once, and not without difficulty. At first, the incidents did not seem connected. They occurred in different places, involved different individuals, and offered little in the way of immediate forensic clarity. Each case stood on its own, a separate tragedy, a separate mystery. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, patterns began to emerge, similarities that could not be ignored. Victims who shared certain characteristics, attacks that followed a similar structure, locations that, when mapped together, began to form a geographic cluster. It is in that space between isolated incidents and a recognized pattern that the true horror of this story begins to take shape. Because once the pattern is visible, it becomes impossible to unsee. And what it reveals is not just a series of crimes, but a sustained threat. A presence moving through a community, selecting targets, acting without warning, and then disappearing back into the ordinary world as if nothing had happened. For those who lived in these areas, the realization came slowly. There was no single moment when everything changed. Instead, there was a gradual shift in perception. Streets that once felt familiar began to feel uncertain. The simple act of walking home alone took on a different meaning. People became more aware of their surroundings, more cautious, more alert to the possibility that danger might not announce itself in advance. And at the center of this growing unease was a question that remained unanswered for far too long. Who was responsible? The answer, when it finally came, would not bring immediate comfort, because identifying the perpetrator is only part of the process. Understanding how he was able to act repeatedly without being stopped, that is something else entirely. It requires looking back, re-examining assumptions, and confronting the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the signs are there, but they're not recognized in time. This is not a story about a single moment. It is a story about a series of moments, each one building on the last, each one contributing to a larger picture that only becomes clear in hindsight. It is a story about victims who had no reason to believe they were in danger, about a community that did not know it was being watched, and about a man who exploited that lack of awareness with devastating consequences. And as we move deeper into this case, one thing will become increasingly clear. The most frightening aspect of these crimes is not just what happened, but how easily it could happen again under the right conditions in the right place, with the wrong person waiting for the right moment. In order to understand the weight of what happened, it is necessary to begin not with the perpetrator, but with the lives that were interrupted, lives that, until the moment they intersected with violence, followed paths that were ordinary, structured, and entirely undeserving of the endings they were given. Southwest London in the early 2000s was not a place associated with fear. Areas like Hampton, Isleworth, and Twickenham carried a sense of routine stability. Streets were lined with modest homes, small businesses, and public spaces that functioned as the backdrop to daily life. People moved through these neighborhoods with a level of trust in their environment, a quiet assumption that the risks they faced were limited to the predictable inconveniences of city living. Public transport, late work shifts, evening walks. These were not activities that required calculation or concern beyond the usual awareness expected in any urban setting. It was within this context that the victims of Levi Belfield lived their lives, each one unaware that their routines would place them in the path of someone who operated outside the boundaries of reason or empathy. Marcia McDonnell was 19 years old, at an age defined by forward movement, by the gradual construction of independence and identity. She worked at a beauty salon, a job that, while ordinary, reflected a life in progress, structured, purposeful, and grounded in everyday interactions. There's a quiet dignity in that kind of work, in the repetition of tasks that build towards something larger over time. On the day she was killed, there was nothing to distinguish it from any other. No indication that it would end differently. She finished her shift, stepped back into the world she knew, and began the journey home. It is in that transition, from the controlled environment of work to the open unpredictability of the street, that her life intersected with violence. There was no relationship, no prior contact, no warning. Her presence in that place at that time was enough, and that is what makes her story so difficult to process. The absence of any narrative that might explain why she, specifically, became a target. The same could be said for Kate Sheedy, who at 18 stood on the threshold of adulthood. Her life, like Marcia's, was defined by routine and expectation, by the assumption that the world, while imperfect, followed certain rules. When she was attacked, those assumptions were shattered in an instant. The violence she experienced was not only physical, but disorienting, because it defied the logic people rely on to make sense of danger. There was no escalation, no interaction that might have signaled what was about to happen. And yet, unlike the others, Kate survived. That survival placed her in a unique and profoundly difficult position. She became a witness, not just to her own attack, but to the existence of a pattern that had not yet been fully recognized. Her account would later serve as a critical piece of the investigation, offering details that could be examined, compared, and ultimately connected to other incidents. But at the time, her experience stood alone, one more event in a landscape that had not yet revealed its full shape. Amélie Delagrange brought a different dimension to the story. At 22, she was living in London as a French national, part of the broader movement of young people who come to cities like London in search of opportunity, experience, and independence. Her presence in the city was a reflection of its openness. its role as a place where people from different backgrounds converge and build temporary or permanent lives. That sense of possibility is part of what defines urban life. And it is also what makes crimes like this resonate beyond local boundaries. When Amelie was killed, the impact extended beyond the immediate community, drawing attention from outside the UK and reinforcing the idea that this was not an isolated or easily contained situation. Her life, like the others, was not defined by the way it ended, but the circumstances of her death forced it into a narrative that would become central to understanding the broader pattern of violence. Then there is Millie Dowler, whose case stands apart in its emotional weight and its broader societal impact. At 13, Millie was significantly younger than the other victims, still in the early stages of adolescence, navigating a world that, for most people her age, remains structured and supervised. Her disappearance on the way home from school introduced a different kind of fear, one that extends beyond individual vulnerability to encompass families, communities, and the systems meant to protect children. When she did not arrive home, the absence itself became the first signal that something was wrong. The search that followed, and the eventual discovery of her body 6 months later, transformed her case into a focal point of public attention and concern. It was not immediately connected to the other incidents, and, for a time, it existed as a separate tragedy. But in hindsight, it would become one of the most significant elements in understanding the full scope of Belfield's actions. What links these individuals is not just the fact that they were targeted by the same person, but the complete absence of connection between them. They did not share social circles, workplaces, or routines beyond the broad patterns of urban life. They were not chosen because of who they were in any personal sense, but because of where they were and how accessible they appeared in a given moment. This randomness is a defining characteristic of the case. It removes the possibility of anticipation, of identifying risk through association or behavior. It suggests a form of violence that is opportunistic, driven by internal factors rather than external triggers. And that, in turn, alters the way such crimes are perceived. Because when there is no clear reason, no identifiable pattern of selection beyond vulnerability, the scope of potential victims expands in a way that is difficult to contain or predict. The environment in which these events occurred did not change immediately. Streets remained the same, buildings unchanged, routines continuing. But beneath that surface continuity, something had shifted. The assumption of safety, once implicit, became conditional. People began to consider factors they had previously ignored: time of day, isolation, the presence or absence of others. These are not dramatic changes, but they reflect a deeper awareness, a recognition that the boundaries between ordinary life and extraordinary violence are not as fixed as they might appear. In examining the lives of these victims, it becomes clear that the story is not about a single defining moment, but about the interruption of continuity. Each of them was engaged in the process of living, working, moving, planning, existing within a framework that provided structure and meaning. The violence they encountered did not arise from that framework. It was imposed from outside by someone who operated according to a different set of rules. And it is in that contrast between the predictability of their lives and the unpredictability of the attacks that the full impact of this case can be understood. The sequence of events that would later define the case of Levi Belfield did not begin with recognition. It began with separation, incidents that appeared isolated, each one contained within its own timeline, its own investigation, its own unanswered questions. Only in retrospect would they be arranged into a pattern. But at the time, each event unfolded as its own moment of disruption, abrupt and disorienting, with no clear indication that it was part of something larger. The earliest point in that sequence, based on what would later be established, traces back to the disappearance of Millie Dowler on March 21st, 2002. She was 13 years old, and on that day, she was simply making her way home from school in Walton-on-Thames, Surrey. There was nothing unusual about the journey itself. It was a route she had taken before, a routine embedded in the structure of her daily life. But somewhere along that path, something changed. The details of the exact moment remained defined only by what is known afterward. That she did not arrive home, that her absence was noticed, and that a search began. At first, the situation carried the uncertainty that accompanies any missing person case. There are always possibilities, always questions that extend in multiple directions. But as time passed, the lack of answers began to shift the tone from uncertainty to concern, and eventually to something more severe. 6 months later, her body was discovered in a wooded area. The distance between the moment she was last seen and the moment she was found created a gap that could not be easily filled. And at that stage, there was no confirmed link to any other crime. Her case stood alone, defined by its own timeline and its own unresolved elements. The next event in this sequence occurred on February 4th, 2003, in Hampton, southwest London. Marcia McDonnell, 19 years old, had just finished her shift at a beauty salon. Like many others, she was returning home, moving through a familiar environment with no reason to expect danger. The attack, when it came, was immediate and from behind. There was no interaction, no exchange that might have provided context or warning. The weapon used was a hammer, a choice that reflected a direct and forceful method. The injuries she sustained were severe, and she later died from head trauma. At the time, the case was treated as a singular act of violence. There was no established connection to the earlier disappearance of Millie Dowler, and no clear motive that could explain why Marcia had been targeted. The randomness of the attack made it difficult to categorize, and without a broader pattern to reference, it remained an isolated investigation. More than a year later, on May 28, 2004, another incident occurred in Isleworth, London. Kate Sheedy, 18 years old, was walking when she was approached and attacked. The method was consistent with what had happened to Marcia McDonnell. A sudden assault using a hammer, delivered without warning. The force of the attack caused her to collapse, but what followed introduced an additional element. After striking her, the attacker dragged her into the road, positioning her in such a way that the scene could be interpreted as a traffic accident. A passing vehicle subsequently struck her. Despite the severity of the injuries she sustained, both from the initial assault and the subsequent collision, Kate survived. That survival would later become a critical factor, but at the time, the focus was on her recovery and the immediate circumstances of the attack. The attempt to disguise the assault as an accident suggested a level of awareness on the part of the attacker, an effort to obscure the nature of the crime, but without a clear link to previous incidents. This case, too, was initially treated within its own context. Less than 3 months later, on August 19, 2004, the pattern continued in Twickenham Green, London. Amelie Delagrange, 22 years old, was attacked at night while walking. The method once again involved a hammer, and the assault was carried out with the same suddenness and lack of interaction seen in the earlier cases. She sustained fatal injuries and died as a result. What distinguished this case, however, was the presence of forensic evidence. DNA was recovered from her body, providing a tangible link to the person responsible. At the time, this evidence did not immediately resolve the case, but it introduced a new dimension to the investigation, one that would later prove decisive. When these incidents are viewed individually, each one presents its own set of facts, its own timeline, its own investigative challenges. But when placed side by side, the similarities become increasingly difficult to ignore. The victims were all young females. The attacks occurred in public or semi-public spaces. The method involved a blunt instrument, specifically a hammer, used in a direct and forceful manner. There was no evidence of a personal connection between the attacker and the victims. And in each case, the assault was sudden, with no prior interaction that might have signaled intent. These elements, when considered collectively, begin to form a pattern, not one that was immediately recognized, but one that would later become central to understanding the scope of what had taken place. The progression of events also suggests an escalation, not necessarily in method, but in frequency and proximity. From the disappearance in 2002 to the series of attacks in 2003 and 2004, there is a narrowing of both time and space. A clustering of incidents within a specific geographic area of southwest London. This concentration would later become a key factor in linking the cases, but at the time, it was not immediately apparent. Each investigation moved forward based on the information available within its own framework, without the benefit of a broader perspective. It is this lack of immediate connection that allowed this sequence to continue. Without a recognized pattern, there was no unified response, no coordinated effort that might have identified the common elements earlier. The attacker operated within that gap, moving between incidents without being directly tied to any of them in a way that could prompt immediate intervention. The randomness of the victim selection further complicated the situation. There were no shared characteristics beyond age and gender, no behavioral patterns that could be used to predict or prevent future attacks. This unpredictability made it difficult to establish a clear profile. And in the absence of such a profile, the investigation remained fragmented. The turning point in this sequence would not come from a single event, but from the gradual accumulation of details that, when combined, began to challenge the assumption that these were isolated incidents. The survival of Kate Sheedy provided an account that could be compared against the evidence from other cases. The recovery of DNA in the case of Amelie Delagrange introduced a scientific basis for connection, and the geographic clustering of the incidents suggested that the same individual could be responsible. But these realizations did not occur all at once. They emerged over time as investigators revisited earlier cases with new information, re-examining evidence in light of patterns that had not been visible before. By the time these connections began to solidify, the sequence of events had already left a lasting impact. Multiple lives had been lost, one had been irrevocably altered, and a community had been exposed to a form of violence that did not conform to expected patterns. The incidents themselves, when viewed in isolation, were difficult to explain. But when viewed together, they revealed something far more concerning. A sustained series of attacks carried out by an individual who selected victims at random, acted without warning, and remained unidentified long enough to repeat the pattern. It is within this progression, from isolated events to recognized pattern, that the true nature of the case begins to emerge, setting the stage for the investigation that would follow. The investigation into the series of attacks later attributed to Levi Belfield did not begin as a unified effort. Instead, it unfolded in fragments shaped by the structure of individual cases that at first appeared unrelated. Each incident generated its own investigative process, its own collection of evidence, and its own set of working assumptions. In the absence of an immediate identifiable link, law enforcement approached each event within the confines of its specific circumstances. This is not unusual in complex criminal investigations, particularly when the crimes in question lack obvious connections. But in this case, that fragmentation created a delay, one that would only be resolved through the gradual recognition of patterns that were not immediately visible. The earliest case, the disappearance and eventual discovery of the body of Millie Dowler, presented investigators with a challenging scenario. A missing child case carries its own protocols, its own urgency, and its own range of possibilities. At the time, there was no confirmed evidence linking her disappearance to any other crime. The 6-month gap between when she was last seen and when her body was found further complicated the process, limiting the availability of immediate forensic leads. As a result, the investigation moved forward without a clear suspect and without a framework that could connect it to future events. When Marcia McDonald was attacked and killed in 2003, the circumstances were different, but not obviously connected. This was a direct assault carried out in a public setting with a clear cause of death. Investigators would have examined the immediate environment, potential witnesses, and any available physical evidence. But without a suspect or a clear motive, the case remained open-ended. At this stage, there was no established reason to link it to the earlier disappearance of Millie Dowler. The method, an attack from behind using a hammer, was noted, but without additional points of comparison, it did not immediately suggest a broader pattern. The investigation into this case, like the first, proceeded independently. The attack on Kate Sheedy in May 2004 introduced a critical new element, a surviving victim. Unlike the previous cases, this incident provided direct testimony, an account of the attack from someone who had experienced it and lived. Her description of the attacker, while necessarily limited by the circumstances, offered investigators a reference point that had not been available before. This was not just a collection of physical evidence or forensic data. It was a narrative, a sequence of events as perceived by the victim. Importantly, her account included the method of attack and the behavior that followed, specifically the attempt to stage the incident as a traffic accident by moving her into the road. This detail suggested intent beyond the immediate act of violence. It indicated an awareness of how the crime might be interpreted in an effort to manipulate that interpretation. Even so, at this stage, the case was still being considered within its own context. The connection to earlier incidents was not yet firmly established. The death of Amelie Delagrange in August 2004 marked a turning point, not because the nature of the attack was fundamentally different, but because of the evidence it produced. As in the previous assaults, the method involved a hammer and a sudden, unprovoked attack. But in this case, investigators were able to recover DNA from the victim's body. This introduced a level of specificity that had been lacking in the earlier cases. DNA evidence provides a direct biological link to an individual, and when entered into national databases, it can be compared against existing records. At the time of collection, this evidence did not immediately identify a suspect, but it created a foundation, something that could be revisited, reanalyzed, and ultimately used to confirm a connection once a potential match was identified. It is at this stage that the investigation began to shift from isolated inquiries to a more integrated approach. The similarities between the cases, young female victims, attacks in public spaces, the use of a hammer, and the geographic concentration in southwest London, became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Investigators began to consider the possibility that these were not separate incidents, but part of a series carried out by the same individual. This realization did not come from a single piece of evidence, but from a convergence of multiple factors: the testimony of Kate Sheedy, the forensic evidence from the case of Amelie Delagrange, and the emerging pattern of victimology in method. Once this possibility was acknowledged, the focus of the investigation expanded. Cases that had previously been handled independently were re-examined in relation to one another. Evidence was reviewed with the goal of identifying common elements, and investigative resources were coordinated to address the broader pattern. This process of reevaluation is a critical component of complex investigations. It allows for the integration of new information and the reassessment of earlier conclusions in light of emerging patterns. In this case, it led to the development of a more cohesive understanding of the perpetrator's behavior. The role of forensic science became increasingly central at this point. The DNA recovered from Amelie Delagrange provided a reference that could be matched against potential suspects. At the same time, data from mobile phones, specifically location and usage records, offered an additional layer of information. Mobile phone data can place individuals within specific geographic areas at particular times. And when combined with other forms of evidence, it can help establish patterns of movement and presence. The integration of these data sources allowed investigators to move beyond general patterns and toward the identification of a specific individual. That individual was Levi Belfield. The process by which he was identified involved the alignment of multiple forms of evidence. The DNA link, the consistency of the attacks with his known behavior, and the corroborating data from mobile phone records. This convergence provided a level of certainty that was necessary to move forward with an arrest. In 2004, Belfield was taken into custody. His arrest marked the transition from investigation to prosecution, but it also represented the culmination of a process that had taken place over several years. Across multiple cases, and through the gradual integration of evidence that had initially appeared disconnected. The identification of Belfield did not erase the complexity of the investigation. Instead, it highlighted the challenges inherent in cases where the perpetrator operates without a clear pattern of personal connection to the victims. The randomness of the attacks, the lack of immediate forensic links in the earlier cases, and the initial fragmentation of investigations all contributed to the time it took to recognize the full scope of what had occurred. But once the connections were established, the evidence formed a coherent narrative, one that could be presented in court, supported by both scientific data and witness testimony. The investigation, in this sense, was not defined by a single breakthrough, but by a series of incremental developments. Each piece of evidence, each re-examined detail, each connection drawn between cases contributed to a larger understanding. And it was that cumulative process that ultimately led to the identification and arrest of the individual responsible, bringing an end to a series of attacks that had, for a time, existed without a clear explanation. By the time Levi Belfield was brought into custody in 2004, the investigation had already begun to consolidate what had once been separate and seemingly unrelated cases into a single, coherent narrative. But an arrest in itself is only the beginning of a different kind of process, one that shifts from the reconstruction of events to the formal presentation of evidence, from the search for a suspect to the legal requirement of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. That transition took place in 2008 when Belfield stood trial at the Old Bailey, one of the most significant criminal courts in the United Kingdom. The setting carried its own weight, not only because of its history, but because of the seriousness of the charges being brought forward. This was not a case built on a single incident, but on a series of acts that, when considered together, revealed a pattern of violence that the court would have to examine in detail. The prosecution's case rested on the convergence of multiple forms of evidence, each one reinforcing the others. Central to this was the forensic link established through DNA recovered in the case of Amelie Delagrange. Unlike circumstantial evidence, DNA provides a direct biological connection between an individual and a crime scene, and its presence introduced a level of specificity that could not easily be dismissed. This evidence did not stand alone. It was supported by data derived from mobile phone records, which placed Belfield within relevant geographic areas at times consistent with the attacks. Together, these elements formed a framework that connected him not only to a single incident, but to a broader sequence of events. The testimony of Kate Sheedy added another dimension to the proceedings. As the only known survivor of the attacks, her account carried both evidentiary and emotional significance. She was able to describe the nature of the assault, the method used, and the actions that followed. including the attempt to stage the incident as a traffic accident. Her testimony provided the court with a narrative perspective, complementing the forensic and technical evidence with a human account of what had occurred. It also reinforced the consistency of the method used across the different cases, aligning her experience with the known details of the attacks on other victims. The prosecution presented the case in a way that emphasized pattern and repetition. The victims, Marcia McDonnell, Amelie Delagrange, and the assault on Kate Sheedy, were not treated as isolated incidents, but as interconnected elements of a sustained course of conduct. The similarities in victim profile, location, and method were highlighted to demonstrate that these were not random, unrelated events, but the actions of a single individual operating according to a consistent pattern. This approach required the court to consider not only the evidence for each individual charge, but also the broader context in which those charges existed. The defense, as in any criminal trial, would have been tasked with challenging the reliability and interpretation of the evidence presented. In cases involving forensic data, this often involves questioning the methods of collection, the chain of custody, and the conclusions drawn from the analysis. In cases involving witness testimony, it can involve examining the conditions under which observations were made and the potential for error or misinterpretation. However, the strength of the prosecution's case lay in the way these different forms of evidence supported one another. The DNA evidence provided a direct link. The mobile phone data established presence. And the witness testimony offered a consistent account of the method used. Together, they formed a cohesive narrative that addressed multiple aspects of the case. After the presentation of evidence and the deliberation process, the court reached its verdict. In 2008, Levi Belfield was convicted of the murders of Marcia McDonnell and Amelie Delagrange, as well as the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy. The sentence imposed was a whole life order, meaning that he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is the most severe penalty available under UK law, reserved for cases considered to be of exceptional seriousness. The decision reflected not only the individual crimes, but the pattern of behavior they represented. It acknowledged the sustained nature of the violence and the level of threat posed by the individual responsible. However, the legal process did not end there. In 2011, Belfield was brought to trial again, this time in connection with the murder of Millie Dowler. By this point, he was already serving a whole life sentence. But the significance of this case extended beyond sentencing. It was about establishing accountability, about formally recognizing responsibility for a crime that had, for years, remained unresolved in terms of definitive attribution. The evidence presented in this trial led to his conviction for Millie Dowler's murder. Adding another formal judgment to the record, the outcome reinforced the understanding that the earlier incidents were part of a broader pattern, one that extended back further than initially confirmed. The courtroom, in these proceedings, functioned as the space in which disparate elements were brought together and examined under a single framework. It is where investigative findings are tested, where evidence is scrutinized, and where conclusions are formalized into legal judgments. In the case of Levi Belfield, this process resulted in a series of convictions that collectively addressed multiple acts of violence spanning several years. The verdicts provided a form of resolution, but they also underscored the complexity of the case. The fact that the crimes were not immediately linked, that the pattern was only recognized over time, and that the full scope of the actions became clear only after multiple investigations were integrated. These are factors that shaped both the investigative and judicial processes. The sentence itself, a whole life order, carries a specific meaning within the legal system. It signifies that the individual is considered to pose a continuing risk and that the severity of the crimes warrants permanent incarceration. It is not a decision made lightly. and it reflects the court's assessment of both the actions committed and the broader implications of those actions. In this case, it marked the end of Belfield's ability to operate within society, effectively removing him from the environment in which the crimes had taken place. But while the legal process reached its conclusion, the effects of the case extended beyond the courtroom, influencing not only those directly involved, but also the systems and communities that have been impacted by the events. The conclusion of the legal process in the case of Levi Belfield did not mark an end in any meaningful emotional or societal sense. Rather, it created a fixed point from which the broader consequences of the crimes could be examined more clearly. A conviction, even one resulting in a whole life order, provides a form of accountability, but does not restore what was lost, nor does it fully resolve the questions that emerge in the aftermath of such events. What remains is an altered landscape, one shaped not only by the actions themselves, but by the way those actions are understood, processed, and integrated into public awareness. The victims, Marcia McDonnell, Amelie Delagrange, Millie Dowler, and the surviving witness, Kate Sheedy, do not become defined solely by the crimes committed against them, but their experiences inevitably shape how the case is remembered. Their lives, each distinct and independent, were drawn into a narrative that reflects something larger than any single incident. In examining that narrative, the focus shifts toward impact on families, on communities, and on the systems responsible for response and prevention. The case of Millie Dowler, in particular, had a profound effect on how missing persons cases involving children are approached in the United Kingdom. The initial uncertainty surrounding her disappearance, followed by the delayed discovery of her body, highlighted the challenges inherent in such investigations. In response, there was increased attention to the procedures used in handling missing children cases, including the speed and coordination of search efforts and the integration of information across jurisdictions. While no procedural change can eliminate risk entirely, the case contributed to a broader reassessment of how early stages of disappearance are managed, emphasizing the importance of immediate and sustained action. Beyond procedural considerations, there was also a shift in public perception. The realization that the victims of Levi Belfield were selected at random introduced a form of uncertainty that is difficult to reconcile with everyday life. In many cases, people rely on an implicit understanding that risk can be mitigated through awareness of context, avoiding certain places, recognizing certain behaviors, or maintaining certain boundaries. But when crimes occur without a clear pattern of selection beyond vulnerability and opportunity, those assumptions become less reliable. The randomness of the attacks disrupted the sense of predictability that underpins routine movement through public spaces. For residents of the affected areas, Hampton, Isleworth, Twickenham, and surrounding parts of southwest London, this shift was not abstract. It was experienced in small, incremental changes, increased caution when walking alone, greater attention to surroundings, a heightened awareness of isolation. These are not dramatic transformations, but they reflect a deeper recalibration of how safety is perceived. The environment itself did not change, but the interpretation of that environment did. Streets that had once been navigated without thought became spaces that required consideration. This kind of change, once established, does not easily revert, even after the immediate threat has been removed. The case also prompted reflection within law enforcement and investigative structures. The initial separation of the incidents, each treated as an independent case, was a function of the information available at the time. However, in retrospect, it underscored the importance of identifying patterns across cases, particularly when those cases share key characteristics such as victim profile, method, and geographic proximity. The eventual linking of the crimes was achieved through the combination of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and data analysis. But the delay in recognizing the pattern highlighted the challenges of coordinating information across different investigations. This has implications for how data is shared, how cases are reviewed, and how potential connections are identified in real time. In this sense, the case contributed to an ongoing evolution in investigative practice, emphasizing the need for both specialization and integration. From a psychological perspective, the actions of Levi Belfield have been characterized by a pattern of extreme violence directed toward women, accompanied by a need for control and a lack of apparent motive beyond the act itself. This absence of a conventional motive, such as personal grievance or material gain, complicates attempts to categorize the behavior within familiar frameworks. It suggests a form of violence driven by internal factors rather than external triggers, making it more difficult to anticipate or prevent. At the same time, it reinforces the importance of recognizing behavioral indicators, such as a history of aggression or controlling tendencies, even when those indicators do not immediately escalate to the level of serious crime. The comparison to other cases, such as that of Peter Sutcliffe, arises from certain structural similarities, repeated attacks, a focus on female victims, and the development of a pattern that only becomes fully visible over time. However, each case retains its own specific characteristics, shaped by the individual responsible and the context in which the crimes occur. The comparison is useful not as a means of equating the cases, but as a way of situating them within a broader understanding of how serial offenses can develop and how they are ultimately identified. In the end, what remains is not a single lesson, but a set of observations about the nature of risk, the limits of predictability, and the processes through which understanding is constructed after the fact. The case demonstrates that patterns can exist without being immediately recognized, that evidence can accumulate without forming a clear picture until viewed collectively, and that the absence of motive does not equate to the absence of structure. It also reinforces the central importance of the victims, not as components of a narrative, but as individuals whose lives were interrupted in ways that extend far beyond the moment of the crime. Their stories, when considered together, form the foundation of the case, providing the context within which all other elements, investigation, prosecution, and analysis, must be understood. And perhaps the most enduring aspect of this case is the recognition that the boundary between ordinary life and extraordinary violence is not always marked by clear signals. Sometimes it is defined only in hindsight, after events have already unfolded, leaving behind a reality that must be examined, understood, and, to the extent possible, learned from. A case like that of Levi Belfield does not end cleanly with a verdict, nor does it settle into a single, fixed meaning once the legal process is complete. Instead, it continues to exist in layers, legal, social, psychological, each one revisited over time as people try to understand not just what happened, but what it reveals about the systems and assumptions that shape everyday life. In the years following his conviction, the narrative of the case has remained anchored in the same core elements. A series of unprovoked attacks, a pattern that was only recognized gradually, and a set of victims who shared no connection beyond circumstance. Yet the way those elements are interpreted can shift depending on the perspective from which they are viewed. For investigators, the case becomes an example of how fragmented information can delay recognition of a broader pattern, reinforcing the importance of cross-case analysis and the integration of data from multiple sources. For the public, it serves as a reminder that the absence of visible threat does not necessarily equate to safety, particularly in environments that feel familiar and controlled. And for those more closely connected to the events, It remains something more immediate and personal, defined not by analysis but by loss and disruption. The names associated with the case, Marcia McDonnell, Amelie Delagrange, Millie Dowler, and Kate Sheedy, represent individuals whose lives intersected with that pattern in different ways, but whose experiences collectively define its impact. In revisiting their stories, there's a tendency to search for meaning, to ask whether there were moments that could have altered the outcome, decisions that might have changed the sequence of events. But the structure of the case resists that kind of interpretation. The attacks were not contingent on specific choices made by the victims. They were contingent on the presence of an individual who acted without regard for those choices. This distinction is important because it shifts the focus away from hypothetical alternatives and toward the conditions that allowed the pattern to persist. One of those conditions was the initial lack of connection between the incidents. Each case, when viewed in isolation, presented its own set of challenges, and without a clear link. There was no immediate reason to treat them as components of a single investigation. This is not a failure in a simple sense, but a reflection of how information is processed within complex systems. Patterns are not always visible at the outset. They emerge over time, as data accumulates and is re-examined from different angles. In this case, that process eventually led to the identification and arrest of Levi Belfield, but only after multiple incidents had already occurred. The recognition of that delay has influenced how similar cases are approached, encouraging a more proactive search for connections, even when those connections are not immediately apparent. Another aspect that continues to shape the interpretation of the case is the role of randomness. The victims were not selected based on personal relationships or identifiable conflicts. They were selected based on availability and vulnerability within a given moment. This introduces a level of unpredictability that complicates both prevention and understanding. In many types of crime, patterns of behavior, whether on the part of victims or perpetrators, can be used to anticipate risk. But when selection is effectively random within a defined category, those patterns become less useful. This does not mean that risk cannot be assessed, but it does mean that the variables involved are broader and less precise. For communities, this translates into a more generalized awareness, a recognition that certain environments or situations may carry inherent risk even in the absence of specific warning signs. The case also continues to be referenced in discussions of forensic and investigative methods, particularly the role of DNA evidence and mobile phone data in establishing connections between suspect and crime. These tools, which have become increasingly central to modern investigations, were instrumental in moving the case forward once the possibility of a linked series was considered. The DNA recovered in the case of Amelie Delagrange provided a definitive point of reference, while mobile phone data offered a way to map presence and movement in relation to the timing of the attacks. Together, they allowed investigators to move from a general pattern to a specific individual, bridging the gap between suspicion and proof. The effectiveness of these methods has reinforced their importance in subsequent investigations, contributing to a broader reliance on forensic and digital evidence in complex cases. At the same time, the case underscores the limitations of any single approach. No individual piece of evidence, on its own, was sufficient to establish the full scope of what had occurred. It was the combination of elements, witness testimony, forensic data, geographic analysis, that ultimately produced a coherent picture. This reinforces the idea that complex cases require a multidimensional approach, one that integrates different types of information rather than relying on a single source. In reflecting on the case as a whole, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in the events themselves, but in the way those events have been interpreted and incorporated into broader frameworks of understanding. It is studied as an example of how patterns can remain hidden, how randomness can complicate detection, and how advances in forensic science can eventually provide clarity. But beyond those analytical perspectives, it also remains a reminder of the human cost involved, of the fact that behind every case study, every investigative breakthrough, there are individuals whose lives were permanently altered. The story does not resolve into a simple conclusion, because the questions it raises do not have simple answers. How do you identify a pattern that is not immediately visible? How do you respond to a form of violence that does not follow predictable rules? How do you balance the need for vigilance with the desire to maintain a sense of normalcy? These are questions that extend beyond any single case, and they remain relevant long after the specific details have been established. In that sense, the legacy of the case of Levi Belfield is not confined to the period in which the crimes occurred or the trials that followed. It continues to inform how similar situations are approached, how risks are assessed, and how the boundaries between ordinary life and potential danger are understood. And while those boundaries may never be entirely fixed or predictable, the process of examining cases like this one contributes to a deeper awareness of how they can be recognized, even when they are not immediately apparent. If there is a final layer to a case like this, it is not found in new evidence or additional verdicts, but in the way it continues to exist in memory, both collective and individual, and in how that memory shapes the quiet decisions people make long after the events themselves have passed. The story of Levi Belfield is often framed through its outcomes, the arrest, the convictions, the whole life sentence that ensures he will never return to the streets where the crimes occurred. These are definitive points, clear markers that signal an end to the immediate threat. But beyond those markers lies something less defined and more enduring, the subtle, persistent influence of what happened on the way people understand vulnerability, safety, and the limits of control. The case does not rely on complexity to remain unsettling in many ways. It is the simplicity of the method and the lack of a clear motive that give it its lasting impact. There was no elaborate scheme, no intricate planning that could be studied and deconstructed into a set of identifiable warning signs. Instead, there was directness, an approach that bypassed the expectations people typically associate with violent crime. That directness forces a different kind of reflection, one that does not focus on how something was executed, but on how it was able to occur within environments that appeared stable and familiar. In that sense, the case becomes less about the individual responsible and more about the conditions that allowed the pattern to go unrecognized for as long as it did. The names at the center of the case, Marcia McDonnell, Amelie Delagrange, Millie Dowler, and Kate Sheedy, remain the most important points of reference, not because they define the structure of the investigation, but because they define its meaning. Each of them represents a life that was moving forward within its own context, shaped by routines, relationships, and expectations that were abruptly interrupted. When those lives are considered together, the randomness of the attacks becomes more than a descriptive detail. It becomes the central factor that connects them. There was no shared path that led them to the same outcome, no common decision that placed them in danger. What they shared was circumstance, and it is that element, uncontrolled, unpredictable, that continues to resonate. Over time, cases like this tend to be absorbed into broader narratives about crime and prevention. They are referenced in discussions about investigative methods, about the use of forensic evidence, about the importance of recognizing patterns across seemingly unrelated incidents. These discussions are valuable, and they contribute to the ongoing development of systems designed to respond more effectively to similar situations. But they also risk creating a sense of distance, a shift from the specific to the general that can obscure the individual realities at the core of the case. Maintaining that connection to the individual stories is essential because it grounds the analysis in something concrete, something that cannot be reduced to a set of abstract principles. At the same time, the case invites a more nuanced understanding of how risk is perceived and managed in everyday life. It does not suggest that danger is constant or unavoidable, but it does challenge the assumption that it can always be anticipated through visible cues. The environments in which the attacks occurred were not inherently unsafe. They were ordinary spaces used daily by people who had no reason to expect that they would become sites of violence. This disconnect between appearance and reality is one of the most difficult aspects of the case to reconcile, because it undermines the idea that safety can be fully assessed based on context alone. Instead, it points to the presence of variables that are not immediately visible, factors that exist outside the control of those who move through these spaces. For those who study such cases, there's an ongoing effort to identify those variables, to understand how patterns form and how they can be detected earlier. The case of Levi Belfield contributes to that effort by illustrating both the possibilities and the limitations of investigative work. It shows how evidence, when viewed collectively, can reveal connections that are not apparent in isolation. It demonstrates the value of persistence, of revisiting earlier assumptions in light of new information. But it also highlights the fact that recognition often comes after the fact, that understanding is sometimes built on a sequence of events that cannot be undone. In the end, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a series of reflections that extend outward from the case itself. There is the recognition of loss, which cannot be quantified or resolved through legal outcomes. There is the acknowledgement of progress, in the form of improved investigative techniques and greater awareness of how patterns can emerge. And there is the acceptance of uncertainty, the understanding that not all risks can be predicted or prevented, even in environments that appear secure. These reflections do not provide closure in a traditional sense, but they offer a way of situating the case within a broader context, one that extends beyond the specific details of time and place. And perhaps the most enduring aspect of that context is the reminder that the line between ordinary and extraordinary is not always visible until it has already been crossed. In the quiet spaces of everyday life, the walk home, the familiar street, the routine that repeats itself without thought, that line can remain hidden, unnoticed, until something disrupts it. And when it is disrupted, the effects are not confined to a single moment or a single location. They ripple outward, shaping perception, influencing behavior, and leaving a trace that persists long after the events themselves have become part of the past.